The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the siege of Tarsonis, and the sight that greeted them was chaos. The last major Federation fleet was surrounded by Kreth vessels, and the defensive line was minutes from collapse. Thousands of ships burned in the void, and escape pods drifted among the wreckage while Kreth fighters hunted them down. Captain Jacob Miller stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the tactical display update with enemy positions. Admiral Karen Hughes transmitted a single order to the human fleet. Execute pattern Sierra 7. No explanations and no grand speeches and no dramatic declarations. Just cold professional efficiency that came from generations of military excellence. The human ships moved as one, and their formation was perfect and their timing was flawless. The Kreth had never fought humans who were truly unleashed, and Hive Queen Zaxira was about to learn the difference between humanity restrained and humanity committed. For 150 years, humans had fought with one hand tied behind their backs and used Federation-approved weapons and tactics and coordinated with less capable allies. Now they fought with everything they had, and the Kreth discovered what that really meant. Human. Missiles struck with precision that seemed impossible, and their targeting systems exploited every weakness in Kreth armor that humanity had documented over decades of conflict. Human fighters moved in patterns that confused Kreth sensors, and their pilots executed maneuvers that would have killed members of any other species. Human capital ships concentrated, their fire with a coordination that made them seem like a single organism rather than thousands of individual vessels. The Battle of Tarsonis lasted 6 hours and became the turning point of the war. The Kreth lost 60% of their fleet, and the human forces lost 8 ships. It was not just a victory but a statement, and the galaxy watched in awe and terror. Humanity had been holding back all along, and no one had realized just how much. Hive Queen Zaxira retreated to her hive ship and analyzed the battle data with growing alarm. She had studied human tactics from previous engagements and believed she understood their capabilities. But this was something else entirely, and she realized that humans had been fighting gentle wars for the benefit of their allies. Now they fought a human war, and the difference was terrifying. Lieutenant Danny Price led a fighter squadron that destroyed 3 Kreth carrier organisms in a single engagement, and his maneuvers became legendary among both human and alien pilots. He pushed his fighter beyond its design limits and trusted his instincts in ways that seemed reckless, but were actually the result of training that started before he could walk. When asked later how he survived, he simply said that he had learned from the best. Admiral Hughes commanded fleet operations across 17 star systems simultaneously and demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that no other species believed possible. She coordinated attacks and retreats and supply lines and diplomatic negotiations, all while maintaining perfect awareness of the bigger picture. The Federation military officers who witnessed her work understood for the first time just how far beyond them humanity had been. But humanity did not stop at military victories, and that was what truly shocked the galaxy. Dr. Helen Cross arrived in the liberated systems with hospital ships and relief supplies and teams of human volunteers who worked to rebuild what the war had destroyed. Human engineers repaired infrastructure and restored power and water to worlds that had been dark for months. Human diplomats negotiated ceasefires and evacuations and saved billions of lives without firing a shot. Claire Peterson traveled from world to world and spoke with local leaders about the future. She did not come to conquer or control, but to offer a different vision of what galactic civilization could be. Humanity was not interested in joining the Federation again and instead proposed something new. The Covenant of Free Worlds, where every species would be equal partners and no one paid tribute or taxes, and mutual defense meant mutual respect. The Federation Council watched all of this with shame and awe. Councillor Vren proposed an official vote to invite humanity back into the Federation, with full honors and Senate leadership, and formal apologies from every member. Thexian supported the motion and stood before the council as a broken being, who finally understood what he had destroyed. The vote passed unanimously. Claire received the offer and traveled to Meridian Prime one final time. The council chamber was packed with representatives who waited anxiously to hear humanity's response. She stood at the podium where she had announced humanity's withdrawal and looked at each council member in turn. Then she delivered humanity's answer: the Terran Republic will not rejoin the Federation, and we will form the Covenant, a free worlds where any species can join as absolute equals and no taxes and no servitude and mutual defense and mutual respect, and the Federation can join this Covenant or humanity will help. Willing worlds leave the Federation and join us instead. It was not revenge but revolution, and it offered every species the chance to choose their own future. Theory. Kreth made one final desperate push and threw their entire remaining force at the human fleet in the Nexus system. Hive Queen Zaxira commanded 5,000 Kreth vessels against 3,000 human ships and their new allies. The battle would decide the fate of the galaxy, and both sides knew that there would be no retreat and no surrender. The fighting was brutal, and humanity took heavy losses. Danny's fighter was hit by Kreth fire and his ship tumbled out of control before he managed to eject. Admiral Hughes's flagship took critical damage and lost power to 3 of its main sections. But humans did not break, and their allies fought beside them with courage born from watching human. Example: Jacob led a desperate assault on the Kreth Hive ship with 200 vessels against the most heavily defended target in the galaxy. The plan was insane and the odds were terrible, but they had no choice because killing Hive Queen Zaxira was the only way to end the war. His ship, the Defiance, took hit after hit, and his crew fought to keep systems running even as the hull breached in a dozen places. He ordered the evacuation when his engines failed and his weapons went offline. Most of his crew made it to the escape pods, but Jacob stayed at the helm because someone had to guide the dying ship into its final attack. His last transmission went out to the fleet, and his words were simple: "For everyone we could not save, and for everyone we will save, and this is humanity's promise, and we never stop fighting for what is right." The Defiance rammed into the Hive ship's core, and the explosion lit up the entire system. Hive Queen Zaxira died, and the Kreth swarm collapsed into chaos without her control. The war was over, and humanity had paid the price for victory in blood and sacrifice, as they always had. 1 year later, the Covenant of Free Worlds included 340 species, and the Galactic Federation still existed, but most of its members had joined the Covenant instead. A memorial stood on Meridian Prime with the names of every human who died protecting the galaxy, and at its dedication, Thexian spoke with tears in his eyes. "We called them tools, and we called them inferior, and we were wrong. And humanity taught us that power without honor is nothing, and strength without compassion is weakness." Claire Peterson stood before the gathered species as Secretary General of the Covenant and addressed the galaxy one final time. Humanity did not return for glory or gratitude, and we returned because when humans see suffering, we cannot look away, and when we see injustice, we cannot stay silent, and that is what makes us human, and that is what makes us strong. A statue was unveiled on Earth showing Jacob and the thousands who fell in the final battle. The inscription read that they walked away in silence and returned with thunder, and they asked for nothing and gave everything, and they were human, and that was enough. Captain Danny Price stood before the memorial with young Kira, who was older, now in training to become a Covenant pilot. She asked if humans would always protect the galaxy, and he smiled. Humans will always fight for what is right, and sometimes that means fighting, and sometimes it means walking away, but we never abandon our principles, and that is the promise we make to ourselves and to everyone who stands with us. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and humanity had proven their worth, not through conquest, but through sacrifice, and across 1,000 worlds beings slept peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness humans stood watch, not because they had to, but because they were human, and that was what humans did. 6 months after humanity walked away, the Kreth swarm struck without warning, and 3 entire star systems fell in the first week. The attack came from a direction the Federation had not monitored properly, and the speed of the advance caught everyone by surprise. Hive Queen Zaxira commanded the invasion from her massive hive ship, and her strategy was brutal and effective. She had watched humanity's withdrawal with interest and recognized an opportunity that might never come again. The Federation military scrambled to respond, but the coordination problems that had plagued them for months now proved fatal. The Valorian ships preferred long-range engagements where their superior sensors gave them an advantage. The Cracks fought best at close quarters where their heavily armored vessels could absorb punishment and deal massive damage. Neither strategy was wrong, but they contradicted each other. And without human officers to coordinate the different doctrines, the fleet tore itself apart trying to fight 2 different battles at once. Counselor Vren stood in the emergency command center and watched the tactical displays with growing horror. The Kreth were not just winning, and they were dominating. Every engagement ended in Federation defeat, and every retreat left more colonies exposed. He had warned the council that this would happen, and now his predictions were coming true in the worst possible way. Thexian stood beside him, and for the first time the arrogant Council Prime looked uncertain. The Battle of Helios Gate should have been a turning point. 4,000 Federation ships faced 2,000 Kreth vessels, in a strategic choke point that controlled access to the core worlds. By any reasonable calculation, the Federation should have won easily. Human doctrine had always emphasized concentration of force and superior numbers, and the advantage of defensive positions. But human doctrine required human execution, and the Federation fleet no longer had humans to lead them. The battle lasted 8 hours and became a massacre. Communication breakdowns led to friendly fire incidents, and ships fired on their own allies in the confusion. Battle plans fell apart within minutes as different species failed to understand each other's tactics. The Cracks charged forward while the Valorians hung back, and the gap between them became a killing ground where Kreth fighters swarmed and destroyed ships that were separated from mutual support. When the retreat was finally called, 2/3 of the Federation fleet was gone. The Kreth had lost less than a quarter of their forces, and they pressed forward immediately to exploit their victory. Valoria itself now lay within striking distance, and Thexian watched his homeworld come under threat. He finally understood the magnitude of what he had done, and the weight of it crushed something inside him. The council met in emergency session, and Thexian no longer strutted or preened. He stood before his fellow council members and admitted what many had already realized. They needed humanity, and they needed them desperately. Without human coordination and human tactics and human courage, the Federation was going to fall. The question was whether humanity would answer if they called. Messages went out to Earth immediately, and they offered everything. Full restoration of membership with no conditions and formal apologies from every council member, and reparations for the insult that had been done. The diplomats who carried the messages spoke of mutual benefit and historical friendship, and the greater good of the galaxy. They begged and pleaded and promised that things would be different. Admiral Karen Hughes received the transmissions at Terran Command and read them without expression. She forwarded them to the civilian government along with her analysis, and then she waited. The Terran Senate debated for 3 days, and the arguments were fierce and emotional. Some senators argued that the Federation's collapse was not humanity's problem, and that they should focus on defending their own territory. Others said that genocide was everyone's problem, and that humanity had a moral obligation to help. Captain Jacob Miller was called to testify before the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs. He stood in the hearing room and answered their questions with the honesty that had marked his entire career. Yes, the human military could intervene effectively, and yes, they could turn the tide of the war within weeks. The fleet was ready, and the soldiers were trained, and the strategic plans had already been drafted. Humanity had the power to save the Federation if they chose to use it. Then came the harder question, and Senator Patricia Cole looked at him with tired eyes and asked if they should help. Jacob was quiet for a long moment and thought about the 50,000 dead at Corvin Ridge, and the treaties that had been broken, and the insults that had been endured. He thought about the years of service and sacrifice that had been dismissed as the work of useful tools. Then he said that it was not a military decision, and it was a human one. The Senate voted, and the decision was announced through official channels. The Terran Republic will defend its borders and its people, and we will accept refugees from Federation space who seek shelter, and we will not intervene in Federation conflicts, and humanity's age of fighting other people's wars is over. The statement was clear and final, and left no room for negotiation. Claire Peterson delivered the message personally to the council, because she wanted them to see her face when she said it. Thexian begged, and his composure finally broke completely. He spoke of the billions who would die, and the civilizations that would be erased, and the darkness that would swallow the galaxy. Claire listened to it all, and her expression never changed. When he finished, she spoke quietly, and her words cut deeper than any shout could have. You called us. Tools and tools do not make decisions, and we are sorry for your situation, but this is no longer our responsibility. She turned and left the council chamber and did not look back. The council members sat in stunned silence and realized that humanity truly meant what they said. There would be no rescue and no salvation from the humans who had saved them so many times before. The Kreth swarm advanced, and more worlds fell. The Federation military tried to regroup, but every battle ended in defeat, and every retreat brought the enemy closer to the core systems. Refugees flooded human space by the hundreds of millions, and Dr. Helen Cross worked herself to exhaustion, trying to provide for them all. The temporary housing became permanent settlements, and human volunteers gave food and medicine and shelter to beings whose own governments had failed them. Captain Jacob Miller watched the reports from the front lines and felt something twist inside him. He had argued for staying out of the war and had voted with those who said humanity owed the Federation nothing. But watching the casualty numbers climb and seeing the images of destroyed colonies and hearing the desperate pleas for help made him question his own certainty. "Lieutenant?" Danny Price came to him one evening and found his captain staring at a tactical map of the war zone. Danny was young and idealistic and had not yet learned to hide his emotions the way older officers did. He asked Jacob if they were doing the right thing by staying out of the war. Jacob did not answer because he no longer knew what the right thing was. The Kreth pushed deeper into Federation space, and the Hive ships grew more numerous with each passing week. Hive Queen Zaxira had committed her full strength to this invasion, and she would not stop until the Federation was destroyed. Intelligence reports suggested that the Kreth had been building up their forces for years and had only waited for the right moment to strike. Humanity's withdrawal had given them that moment. Admiral Hughes studied the same intelligence reports and saw something that made her call an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs. The Kreth were not planning to stop at the Federation borders, and their fleet movements suggested they were preparing to push into human space once the Federation fell. Humanity was not safe through isolation, and they were just buying time at the cost of billions of innocent lives. The reports went to the Senate and a new debate began. This time the question was different, and it was not about helping the Federation, but about defending humanity's future. If they waited until the Federation fell, they would face the full might of the Kreth alone, and the cost in human lives would be catastrophic. If they intervened now, they could fight alongside potential allies and stop the Kreth before they grew too strong. On Earth, humans wrestled with the hardest question their species had ever faced. Justice or survival in principle, or pragmatism in the past or the future. The galaxy waited and the Kreth advanced, and time was running out for everyone. 9 months after humanity walked away, Captain Jacob Miller made a decision that would change the course of history. He volunteered to escort refugee convoys from the war zone to human space, and took his small fleet to the edge of Federation territory against the explicit orders of his superiors. What he saw there broke something inside him and rebuilt it into something harder and clearer. The colonies on the frontier were dying, and not from military attacks, but from the collapse of everything that made civilization possible. Food shipments had stopped and medical supplies were gone, and the infrastructure that provided power and water was failing. Children cried in the streets, and parents made impossible choices about which of their offspring would get the last rations. Jacob watched it all and understood that war was not just about battles and explosions, but about the slow death of hope. On one rescue mission to a settlement called Haven's Edge, he met a young Valorian girl named Kira. Her family had died when the Kreth overran her colony, and she had survived by hiding in a storage container for 3 days without food or water. She was maybe 10 years old by human standards, and her eyes held a kind of emptiness that no child should ever know. When Jacob lifted her into the transport ship, she looked at him and asked a question that would haunt him forever. "Why won't you help us, and we need heroes?" He had no answer for her and no words that could explain the complex political and emotional reasons why humanity had chosen to stay out of the war. How could he tell a child that her suffering was the price of human pride, and that her people's arrogance had bought their abandonment? So he said nothing and simply held her while she cried. Lieutenant Danny Price confronted his mentor that evening in the captain's quarters. The young officer's face was red with anger and frustration, and he spoke with a passion that reminded Jacob of his own younger self. They had the power to stop the genocide, and every day they waited meant millions more would die. What had happened to protecting those who could not protect themselves, and what had happened to the principles that made humanity worth following? Jacob argued back, and his voice was tired. They had tried protecting others for 150 years, and the Federation had thrown it in their faces. Humans had died by the millions for beings who saw them as tools, and now those same beings expected humanity to come running back the moment things got difficult. They owed the Federation nothing and had every right to focus on their own people. But Danny would not back down, and his words cut through Jacob's defenses. They did not do it for the Federation, and they did it because it was right. Humans did not abandon people to genocide, and that was who they were at their core. If they let the Kreth slaughter billions just to prove a point, then they were no better than Thexian and his council of cowards. The real question was not whether the Federation deserved help, but whether humanity deserved to call itself civilized. The debate spread across human space like wildfire. In the Senate and in military briefings and in homes and schools and workplaces, humans argued about what their species stood for. Some said that isolation was the only way to protect themselves, and that getting involved would just lead to more human deaths for beings who would never appreciate the sacrifice. Others said that humanity's greatest strength had never been military power but moral courage, and that walking away from genocide made them complicit in it. Claire Peterson visited the refugee camps and spoke with thousands of beings who had lost everything. They thanked her for the shelter that humanity provided and asked for nothing more. But their gratitude felt like an accusation, because she knew that humanity could do more and was choosing not to. She watched Dr. Helen crosswork 18-hour days trying to care for beings whose wounds could have been prevented if humans had intervened sooner. One evening, Claire sat with a group of refugees around a fire and listened to their stories. An elderly Krax warrior spoke of his son who died defending his colony when the Kreth attacked. A Valorian scientist described watching her research station burn and her life's work turned to ash. A merchant from a species Claire did not recognize told of losing his mate and his children, and his reason for living. They did not blame humanity for their losses, but their quiet acceptance was worse than any accusation. Commander Nina Brooks brought new intelligence to Admiral Hughes, and the implications were terrifying. The Kreth were not just planning to attack Federation space, and they had been preparing an assault on human territory for years. Intercepted communications showed that Hive Queen Zaxira saw humanity as the only real threat to Kreth expansion, and intended to destroy Earth and every human colony once the Federation fell. The Kreth had learned from their previous defeats, and this time they would not stop until humanity was extinct. Admiral Hughes called an emergency meeting of the military leadership and laid out the intelligence in stark terms. Humanity could fight the Kreth now with potential allies and infrastructure and resources from the Federation, or they could fight them later alone, over the ashes of 1 billion worlds. Either way, the war was coming, and the only question was when and how. The Terran Senate was deadlocked at 400 votes for intervention and 400 votes against. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Dr. Helen Cross appeared before the Senate with representatives from the refugee communities. 200 million beings had signed a petition that she carried, and the message was not what anyone expected. They did not beg for military intervention or demand that humans save them. Instead, they thanked humanity for the shelter they had been given and volunteered to fight alongside human forces if humanity chose to act. They had watched humans work themselves to exhaustion providing food and medicine and protection to beings from dozens of different species. They had seen what honor looked like and wanted to show humanity that some beings were capable of learning. A young Krax warrior named Torin stood before the Senate and spoke with a voice that carried weight despite his youth. His father had died in the Battle of Helios Gate because Federation leadership was incompetent and corrupt, but he did not blame humanity for staying out of that disaster. However, he had also seen human volunteers in the refugee camps work until they collapsed, and then get up and work some more. That was who humans were. And if they chose to fight, then Torin would fight beside them to prove that not all Federation citizens were like Thexian. Captain Jacob Miller watched the testimony from his ship and felt something shift inside him. He thought about young Kira and her question about heroes. He thought about Danny's words about doing what was right regardless of whether it was appreciated. He thought about the 200 million refugees who were willing to fight not for their own governments but alongside the humans who had shown them kindness. He made his decision and recorded a message to Earth. He was taking his fleet to the Federation front, and anyone who wanted to follow him could, but he would understand if they did not. This was not about the council or politics or old grievances. It was about doing what was right when no one else could, and it was about being human and all that meant. His message spread through the human military like lightning, and within hours other captains began declaring their intention to follow. Admiral Hughes herself made the decision to join them and brought the flagship Resilience along with 2,000 volunteer vessels. The Terran Senate voted again, and this time the result was different. Humanity would intervene, but not as Federation members and not under Federation command. They would fight as free actors, answering only to their own conscience. Jacob stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the fleet assemble around him. 47 ships had become 2,000, and the volunteers kept coming. Danny stood beside him with a smile that said he had known all along that his captain would make the right choice. The tactical display showed the jump coordinates to the Federation front and the distance they would have to travel. Admiral Hughes opened a communication channel to the entire fleet, and her voice was steady and strong. Humanity walks together, and let's remind the galaxy what that means. The fleet jumped to hyperspace and left human territory behind. They were going back to war, but this time they fought for themselves and for the principles they refused to abandon, and for every innocent being caught in the darkness. The humans had walked away in silence, and now they returned with purpose, and the galaxy would learn what it meant when humanity decided that enough was enough. 3 months had passed since humanity left the Galactic Federation, and the cracks were beginning to show. Admiral Karen Hughes stood in the command center of Terran Defense Station 1 and watched the holographic displays that showed the positions of every human vessel in known space. The withdrawal had been completed ahead of schedule, and every human was now safely within Terran territory. She should have felt satisfied, but the reports coming in from Federation space troubled her deeply. On the industrial world of Factorum 7, the manufacturing plants had ground to a halt. Engineer Lucas Grant had been the network chief there for 12 years, and he had designed systems that could produce enough components to supply half the Federation fleet. The automated processes were intricate and delicate and required constant adjustment to maintain efficiency. Lucas had tried to train Federation personnel before he left, but the complexities were too great for anyone to master in the few weeks they had been given. Now the plants sat silent and the orders piled up, and the Federation scrambled to find alternatives that did not exist. Lucas himself was now on Mars overseeing the expansion of human manufacturing facilities, and when asked if he felt any guilt about leaving his work unfinished, he simply said that he had fulfilled his contract and trained every person they sent to him, and what happened after humans left was not his responsibility. The border stations reported increasing pirate activity, and the numbers grew worse each day. For decades, human patrol fleets had maintained a constant presence along the frontier, and their quick response times had made piracy a dangerous and unprofitable business. The pirates had learned to avoid sectors where human ships operated, and they had stayed in the shadows where the Federation's less capable security forces struggled to track them. Now the humans were gone, and pirates like Zathos saw an opportunity that might never come again. His raiders struck merchant convoys with impunity, and the Federation military took days to respond to distress calls that humans would have answered in hours. Frontier colonies sent desperate messages begging for protection, but the Federation had no ships to spare and no commanders who could coordinate the kind of rapid response that humanity had made look effortless. Counselor Vren watched the chaos unfold with growing alarm, and he was one of the few council members who had voted against the reclassification of humanity. He had studied human history and culture, and he understood that humans did not make empty threats and did not bluff about matters of principle. When Claire Peterson said that humanity was leaving, she meant it absolutely. He brought his concerns to the council chamber and laid out the reports in stark detail. Manufacturing down 40% across 12 sectors, and pirate attacks up 300% on the frontier, and coordination failures in every joint military operation. The Federation military had discovered that their command structure had been held together by human officers, who served as translators and mediators, and tactical advisors. Without them, orders got lost in translation, and plans fell apart before the first shot was fired. Thexian dismissed his concerns, and his feathers ruffled with irritation as he spoke. The Federation was simply adjusting to temporary logistics challenges, and they would hire mercenaries to patrol the borders and promote talented individuals from within to fill the vacant positions. He refused to admit that the problem was bigger than anyone had imagined, and to do so would be to admit that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. The mercenaries they hired proved to be worse than useless, and they demanded enormous payment for minimal effort and some turned to piracy themselves when they realized the Federation had no way to hold them accountable. The promoted officers tried their best, but they lacked the training and experience that human officers had developed over generations of service. What had once been a smoothly functioning military machine now lurched from crisis to crisis. Meanwhile, Earth had gone completely quiet, and the silence was more unnerving than any threat could have been. Human colonies recalled their citizens, and the Terran Republic closed its borders to all non-emergency traffic. Military resources were diverted to defending Sol System and the 27 human colony worlds. Trade with the Federation dropped to nothing as human merchants chose to focus on internal markets. Ambassador Claire Peterson issued a single public statement, and her words were brief and professional. Humanity will focus on its own people, and we wish the Federation success in their endeavors. That was all, and no elaboration and no explanation, and no indication of what humanity planned for the future. The Federation sent diplomats to negotiate, but they were turned away politely at the border. The Terran Republic would accept refugees who sought shelter, but all other traffic was denied. The refugee situation had begun almost immediately after humanity's withdrawal, and beings from across the Federation requested asylum in human space. They were merchants who had worked with human traders and scientists who had collaborated with human researchers and families who had made friends with human neighbors. Some came because they feared the growing instability, and others came because they had been treated poorly by their own governments and knew that humans valued fairness and justice. Dr. Helen Cross managed the Icon refugee processing centers, and the numbers overwhelmed her facilities within the first month. She had expected thousands, but instead received millions. The Terran government authorized the construction of temporary housing on uninhabited moons and asteroids, and human volunteers worked around the clock to provide food and medical care and education to beings who had lost everything. The refugees spoke of the chaos in Federation space, and their stories painted a picture of a society coming apart at the seams. Supply chains had collapsed, and critical medicines were running short, and disputes that humans had quietly mediated for decades were now erupting into violence. Some Federation members talked openly about seceding and forming their own alliances because the central government seemed unable to maintain order. In the shadows beyond Federation space, something else stirred. Commander Nina Brooks sat in the intelligence center on Luna and studied the sensor data with increasing concern. The Kreth swarm had been dormant for 5 years after humanity had pushed them back in a brutal campaign that cost 30,000 human lives. The insectoid aliens were dangerous and relentless, and only constant vigilance had kept them contained. Human early warning networks had monitored the Kreth territories with a grid of sensors and spy drones and patrol ships. The data was analyzed every hour, and any sign of unusual activity triggered immediate investigation. It was tedious work, but it had prevented surprise attacks and given the Federation time to prepare when the Kreth began mobilizing. Now, those networks were gone, and the Federation had no equivalent system in place. Nina watched the fragmentary data from long-range sensors and saw patterns that made her blood run cold. Energy signatures consistent with Kreth hive ships and movement in sectors that should have been empty, and signs of massive construction projects deep in Kreth space. She sent her reports up the chain of command, and Admiral Hughes reviewed them with a grim expression. The Kreth were preparing for war, and the Federation had no idea what was coming. Admiral Hughes considered sending a warning, but the civilian government had been clear in their instructions. Humanity would defend its own borders and accept refugees, but would not involve itself in Federation affairs. She filed the intelligence reports and ordered increased patrols along the human border with Kreth space, and hoped that the Federation would notice the danger before it was too late. Counselor Vren made another attempt to convince the Council to negotiate with Earth, and he argued that pride was less important than survival. Thexian refused and said that to crawl back to humanity would make the Federation look weak. Other council members supported him because they feared losing face more than they feared the consequences of their decision. The galaxy had become a darker place without humanity's steady presence, and every day brought new reports of failures and conflicts and growing danger. On Earth, humans watched the news from Federation space, and some felt vindication while others felt sorrow. They had given so much for so long and been rewarded with contempt, and now the beings who had dismissed them were learning the true cost of that arrogance, but humanity did not gloat and did not celebrate the Federation's troubles. They simply focused on their own people and built their own future and maintained their silence. The message was clear and would not be repeated, and the galaxy would have to learn its lessons without human teachers. The silence from Terra was absolute, and in that silence the Federation began to truly understand what they had lost. The Grand Chamber of Meridian Prime was filled with representatives from across the galaxy, and the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of centuries of politics and power. Captain Jacob Miller stood in the observation gallery with his arms crossed and watched as the council members took their seats on the floating platforms that circled the central podium. He had seen this room many times before, but today felt different, and a knot of tension sat in his stomach that he could not ignore. Ambassador Claire Peterson walked to the center podium, and her footsteps echoed in the vast space. She carried herself with the dignity that came from years of diplomatic service, but Jacob could see the tiredness in her eyes. 150 years of partnership and humanity had given everything to the Galactic Federation. They had sent their sons and daughters to fight in wars that were not their own, and they had built stations and repaired ships and negotiated peace between species who could barely stand to be in the same room together. Council Prime Texian spread his wings slightly as he looked down at Claire from his elevated platform. The avian leader had always made it clear that he considered humans to be useful but not equal, and today he seemed particularly pleased with himself. Other council members sat in silence, and Jacob recognized a few faces who had once called humanity their friends, but now they looked away when his eyes met theirs. The vote was called, and the holographic display showed the proposal in stark letters. Humanity would be reclassified as auxiliary members with reduced voting rights and increased military obligations, and the protection tax that Earth paid to remain in the Federation would increase by 300%. Jacob felt his jaw tighten as he read the words, and beside him, Lieutenant Danny Price made a sound of disbelief. Claire began to speak, and her voice was steady despite the insult that hung in the air. She reminded the Council of the Battle of Corvin Ridge, where 50,000 human soldiers had died, protecting Valoria itself when the enemy had broken through every other defense. She spoke of the plague years when human medical teams had worked themselves to exhaustion to save 18 different worlds from extinction. She listed the technology that humans had shared freely and the resources they had poured into making the Federation stronger. Thexian interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his wing, and his voice carried the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. He said that humans were useful tools, but they lacked the evolutionary sophistication of the elder races, and that it was time for humanity to accept its proper place in the galactic order. The words fell like hammers, and Jacob saw Claire's hand tighten on the podium, but her face remained calm. The vote began, and the holographic numbers climbed steadily. 847 votes in favor and only 6 against. The chamber filled with the sound of satisfied chatter, as council members congratulated themselves on what they believed was a necessary adjustment to Federation policy. No one seemed to notice the silence from the human delegation or the way that every human in the room had gone very still. Claire asked for a brief recess, and Thexian granted it with barely concealed amusement. She stepped away from the podium and walked to where Jacob stood in the gallery. Her eyes met his, and no words needed to be exchanged because they both knew what came next. She pulled out her secure communicator and contacted Earth directly, and Jacob watched as she spoke quietly with the Terran Senate. 15 minutes passed, and the council chamber slowly refilled with representatives who seemed eager to move on to other business. Thexian was speaking with a group of supporters, and Jacob could hear their laughter from across the room. They thought they had won, and that humanity would accept this humiliation because humans always accepted and always served and always sacrificed without complaint. Claire returned to the podium, and the chamber gradually fell silent. She stood there for a moment and looked at each council member in turn, and then she spoke with a voice that was quiet, but carried to every corner of the vast space. The Terran Republic formally withdraws from the Galactic Federation, effective immediately, and all treaties and defense pacts and mutual aid agreements are hereby terminated, and humanity wishes you well. The silence that followed was absolute, and then chaos erupted. Council members shouted questions and demands, but Claire simply closed her datapad and turned away from the podium. Jacob moved to join her, and every human in the station followed. They walked through the corridors in complete silence, and not one of them looked back at the beings who called after them with increasing desperation. Thexian's voice boomed through the chamber's speakers, and he called it an empty threat and said that humans would return begging within a cycle. Claire did not respond and did not slow her pace. The human delegation reached their shuttle bay and began boarding their ships. Danny Price paused at the doorway and looked back one last time at the station that had been humanity's second home for so long. Jacob put a hand on the young man's shoulder and guided him inside. Within hours, the orders went out across the galaxy, and every human vessel received the same message. Return home immediately, and bring nothing that does not belong to humanity, and leave all stations and facilities in working order. The withdrawal began with the same quiet efficiency that had marked every human operation for the past century and a half. No sabotage and no theft and no angry declarations, just silence. Human engineers finished their shifts and documented their work and transferred access codes to Federation personnel. Human soldiers packed their equipment and left their barracks cleaner than they had found them. Human diplomats closed their offices and filed their final reports. On 1,700 stations and 42 worlds and in 800 ships that had been on loan to Federation forces, humans simply gathered their belongings and left. The Federation watched with growing confusion that slowly turned to concern. Thexian issued statements claiming that humanity's withdrawal was a minor inconvenience and that the Federation was stronger than ever. He announced plans to hire mercenary forces and promote internal candidates to fill the roles that humans had occupied. The other council members echoed his confidence because to admit fear would be to admit that they had made a terrible mistake. But as the last human transport ships jumped to hyperspace and left Federation territory behind, something changed in the galaxy. The constant presence that had kept order for 150 years was gone, and in its place was only silence. Pirates in the outer sectors noticed it first when the regular human patrols failed to appear. Frontier colonies sent messages asking when the human peacekeepers would return. Trade stations reported systems failures that only human engineers had known how to fix. And on Earth, in the halls of government where humanity's leaders gathered to decide their future, a different kind of silence reigned. It was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of determination. Humanity had walked away from the galaxy, and now they would focus on their own people and their own worlds. They had given everything to beings who saw them as tools, and now they would remember what it meant to stand alone. The message went out to every human colony and settlement in the galaxy, and the words were simple: come home and we take care of our own now. The humans walked away in silence, and the galaxy did not yet understand what it had lost.